James Cole stepped into the opulent lobby of Hamilton and Company Bank, a prestigious institution where polished marble floors gleamed beneath the glistening chandeliers, and the air smelled faintly of leather and expensive cologne. The quiet hush of the place was occasionally broken by the sound of polished shoes clicking across the floor and the low murmur of conversations spoken in subdued, authoritative tones. The walls were lined with abstract art that seemed designed to convey power and sophistication. Every detail of this bank screamed exclusivity, wealth, and high society. Traits James had spent a career trying to embody without the luxury of being born into them. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, James looked every bit the successful businessman he was, and yet he knew he stood out here. His dark skin and sharp eyes, a symbol of strength and resilience to him, drew lingering, assessing looks from some of the other patrons and even the bank staff. Despite his impeccable presentation, James felt the unspoken questions in their gazes. This wasn't just a place for banking. It was a place for social judgment, where people were assessed not only by their assets but by their perceived belonging within these walls. As he approached the reception desk, the receptionist, blonde with a practiced, polite smile, took a moment longer than necessary to acknowledge him. Her smile was cordial but shallow, a little too tightly controlled, betraying her surprise or perhaps her curiosity as she looked him up and down. It was a familiar reaction, one he had grown used to over the years. She adjusted her expression quickly, though as if catching herself. James couldn't decide if it was better that she was trying to hide it or if the pretense was worse than outright dismissal. "I have an appointment with Mr. Robert Grant," James said, his voice calm but firm. The receptionist gave a polite nod and directed him to the waiting area. James took a seat on one of the leather couches, smoothing his suit jacket and mentally preparing himself. He knew this meeting would be a defining one. The loan he was here to discuss could be the turning point for his business, which had been growing steadily but needed this financial boost to truly expand. It was an exciting opportunity, but here, in this bank, excitement was dampened by the awareness that he would likely have to prove himself to people who saw him as an outsider. Around him, clients sat with an air of ease, clearly comfortable in a space like this, most of them flipping through financial reports or chatting quietly with bank associates. These were individuals who had probably never doubted their belonging here or worried about the assumptions people made about them. For James, the sense of visibility was almost palpable. He was not an unknown. He had worked hard, achieved measurable success, and yet he felt like he had to constantly reintroduce himself in spaces like these. James sat, hands folded in his lap, his expression calm and composed, but beneath the surface, a myriad of thoughts, frustrations, and emotions brewed. As much as he had prepared for this day, he couldn't completely ignore the sense of apprehension that lingered. He had been in similar situations many times before, each one reminding him of the extra hurdles he had to cross, the unspoken biases he had to maneuver around. He'd built his company from the ground up, facing challenges that others rarely had to consider. Yet here he was, ready to explain why he deserved a loan he had worked so hard to qualify for. Beneath the apprehension, there was also frustration, one that simmered just below his calm exterior. He felt anger at a system that constantly required him to prove his worth beyond the financial statements and growth projections he brought with him. He had seen, countless times, others walk into banks like this and secure what they needed without facing questions that probed into their character or fit. Yet, he had come to accept that his journey would be different. More challenging, yes, but he'd decided long ago that he wouldn't let it defeat him. The thought of the potential impact of this loan reignited his determination. It wasn't just money. It was a pathway to growth, to realizing the vision he had nurtured since he'd first started his business. This expansion would mean more opportunities, more reach, and the ability to make a real difference. He wasn't just working for himself. He was building something that could serve as a legacy, something that could prove in every way possible that he deserved to be in rooms like this, despite what others might think. This loan represented validation, not only for his company but for himself, a testament to his resilience and his ability to succeed despite the odds. But that quiet voice of doubt lingered, reminding him of times he'd been overlooked, of the assumptions that had been made before he even opened his mouth. He knew that this meeting could go either way, and that knowledge weighed heavily on him. He imagined Robert Grant, the senior loan officer he was scheduled to meet, flipping through his file, searching for any reason to dismiss him. The thought was uncomfortable but grounded in his experiences. He had been here before, and he knew that no matter how much he'd prepared, there was always the possibility that someone would decide his background or his appearance disqualified him, regardless of his track record. As he waited, he took a deep breath, summoning the resolve he'd built over years of navigating spaces where he felt both visible and invisible. Visible because of his difference, invisible because, to them, he often wasn't worth noticing beyond that. The anger and frustration simmered down, transforming into something he was more accustomed to: determination. He was here because he had earned the right to be, because he had worked harder than most and had proven himself time and again. He reminded himself of the company he had built, of the employees who relied on him, and of the communities he supported. This was more than a business. It was a mission to challenge perceptions and create opportunities, not just for himself, but for those who would follow. The receptionist finally called his name, signaling that Mr. Grant was ready to see him. James straightened his tie, adjusted his jacket, and stood up, his expression calm but his heart steady with purpose. He knew that the journey ahead would have its challenges, that the prejudices he encountered today might not be the last. But he was prepared to meet each one with dignity and resilience. He walked toward the loan officer's office with his head held high, carrying the weight of his dreams and the determination to see them realized, no matter the obstacles he would face. James Cole stood in the gleaming, intimidating interior of the bank, feeling the weight of the situation settling onto his shoulders. Dressed sharply in a suit that he'd chosen carefully, he knew he looked the part of a successful businessman, but he couldn't shake the lingering apprehension that simmered just beneath his calm exterior. This wasn't his first time stepping into a place like this, but each time he was reminded that, despite his achievements, there were always barriers that seemed tailored just for him. James knew the statistics. He'd read the articles, seen the reports, and knew how hard it was for entrepreneurs like him to get the same fair treatment others received almost by default. He'd built his business from the ground up, facing down each obstacle with a steadfast determination that had, at times, felt like the only thing keeping him moving forward. His company's success was no accident. It was the product of sleepless nights, sacrifice, and relentless effort. This loan wasn't just a means to grow his business. It was a validation of everything he'd worked for, a recognition that his hard work deserved backing. But he had been here before, in situations where people judged him before they even knew his story, sizing him up in a glance, deciding who he was based on superficial details. The frustration of it bubbled under his skin, but he pushed it down, knowing that letting his anger show would only confirm the biases some people held. He had become well-practiced at masking his emotions, channeling his frustration into a quiet, dignified confidence. But the sting of being dismissed or undervalued never truly left. It lingered, a reminder of the unspoken hurdles that people like him faced in a world that wasn't always fair. James glanced around the bank, taking in the faces around him, noting the few other clients who moved with ease and entitlement, clearly comfortable in spaces like these. He wondered if they had ever experienced the gnawing doubt of being judged, if they had ever felt the need to prove themselves worthy of respect and consideration. For James, this wasn't just a business transaction. It was a battle for validation, a chance to prove that he belonged in these spaces just as much as anyone else. In his mind, he replayed the moments where he'd been passed over, where his ideas were ignored until someone else, someone deemed more acceptable, voiced a similar opinion. He remembered the cold smiles, the dismissive glances, and the careful, almost patronizing words that made it clear he was tolerated rather than welcomed. The thought filled him with a wave of bitterness, but he took a slow, steadying breath. He reminded himself of what he was here to do. He had built something remarkable, and he wouldn't let prejudice or judgment stand in his way. He had earned this. Yet, there was that nagging fear, the fear that his hard work and preparation wouldn't be enough to overcome the biases he might face today. The stakes felt enormous. This loan would enable him to take his business to new heights, to create jobs, to impact his community, and to establish a lasting legacy. But it all depended on someone else's judgment, on whether they could see past their assumptions and recognize his worth. James clenched his fists for a brief moment, feeling the smooth fabric of his suit brush against his skin. He was here to win, to demand respect without having to utter a single word. He wasn't just seeking approval. He was fighting for the respect he knew he deserved. Despite the apprehension, despite the anger that simmered under his calm demeanor, he knew he would not walk away quietly if things didn't go his way. With a final deep breath, James steadied himself. He was ready to face whatever lay ahead. No matter the outcome, he would leave this place with his dignity intact, knowing he had fought for his place and the future he envisioned. James took a deep breath as he walked down the hallway toward Robert Grant's office. He had prepared thoroughly for this meeting, but he knew he would need more than a solid business plan to make it through the encounter ahead. As he stepped through the door, his gaze landed on Robert Grant, the senior loan officer and a man who seemed to embody the very ethos of Hamilton and Company Bank. Robert was a tall, imposing figure in his mid-50s, with sharply tailored suits and an aura of importance that he wore like armor. His meticulously combed silver hair and steely gray eyes gave him an air of calculated precision, and every movement seemed measured, as if he never did anything by chance. On his desk lay neatly stacked papers, and beside him, his nameplate shone, with the title Senior Loan Officer engraved in polished gold lettering. This was a man who exuded authority and control, and he didn't have to say a word to make it clear that he held power over the fate of those who walked into his office. Grant's eyes flicked up from the document in front of him, giving James a quick, dismissive glance before gesturing for him to sit without a word. His expression remained unchanged, a mix of indifference and mild impatience. This wasn't the kind of man who felt the need to offer polite niceties or even pretend to be interested in the people who came to him for financial support. In his eyes, clients like James were here to meet his standards, and the burden of proving themselves lay solely with them. "Mr. Cole, was it?" Grant's voice was clipped and formal, without a hint of warmth. He didn't bother to hide the slight condescension in his tone as he finally looked directly at James. There was a hint of a smirk in his expression, as if he already knew that this meeting would be a waste of time. "Yes, James Cole," James replied, maintaining his calm demeanor as he extended his hand. Grant ignored the gesture, choosing instead to glance down at the documents on his desk, as though James's presence in his office were barely worth acknowledging. James lowered his hand, taking a seat without comment, though the slight dismissal stung more than he let on. Grant flipped through the paperwork in front of him, his eyes scanning each page with practiced efficiency, his expression unreadable. James watched, wondering what he might be thinking, knowing that any sign of judgment could shift the outcome of this meeting. After a few minutes of silence, Grant leaned back in his leather chair and looked at James with an air of skepticism. "Mr. Cole, I've reviewed your file, and while it's impressive," he said, his tone laced with a note of disinterest, "I'm curious as to why you chose to come to Hamilton and Company for a loan. This is, after all, a prestigious institution, and we typically work with clients who have a long-standing reputation within our network." The emphasis on prestigious wasn't lost on James, nor was the implication that he somehow didn't belong within this network. He felt the familiar surge of frustration but forced himself to remain composed, knowing that reacting would only reinforce the man's assumptions about him. "Well, Mr. Grant, I believe my business model aligns well with the standards of Hamilton and Company. I've built a company that has shown consistent growth over the past few years, and our projections indicate a strong upward trend. I'm looking to expand, and I believe that securing a loan from your institution would provide mutual benefits. James replied, keeping his voice steady and professional. Grant's eyes narrowed slightly as he listened, a faint smirk crossing his face. He leaned forward, as if preparing to deliver a lecture. You must understand, Mr. Cole, that we have a certain expectation of our clients. Hamilton and Company has a reputation to uphold, and we don't just approve loans because someone believes they're entitled to one. The clients we support are unique. They've established themselves within this industry and have connections and networks that validate their position. James clenched his jaw, biting back the retort that threatened to slip out. I understand, Mr. Grant. I assure you, I wouldn't have come to your institution if I didn't believe my company could meet your standards. Grant chuckled lightly, a sound that was devoid of any true humor. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'll be frank with you, Hamilton and Company is selective. We don't hand out loans to just anyone who thinks they have a promising business. And I must say, Mr. Cole, from what I see here, you're lacking the connections and certain pedigree that many of our clients possess. The words landed heavily, but James refused to let Grant see the sting they carried. Instead, he maintained his professional demeanor, even as the weight of Grant's words settled over him like a shadow. Grant's gaze was unyielding, his smirk widening ever so slightly as if he were testing to see how far he could push. James took a steady breath, keeping his focus. He knew this meeting would be difficult, but he hadn't anticipated such open hostility. He could feel his frustration simmering, but he reminded himself of what was at stake. He had faced people like Grant before, individuals who judged him not for his achievements but for his appearance, and he had learned that showing any frustration only fueled their biases. Mr. Grant, he said calmly, I believe in the strength of my business and the potential for growth. I've taken every measure to ensure that my projections and financials align with your institution's standards. I'm here to work with Hamilton and Company because I believe it's the right choice for the future of my company. I came prepared with a clear plan, and I'm open to answering any questions you may have. Grant's smirk faded slightly, and he leaned back again, his fingers tapping rhythmically on his desk. You certainly sound prepared, Mr. Cole. However, business isn't just about numbers and plans. It's about perception and relationships. We support clients who bring value beyond their balance sheets, those who reflect the integrity of this institution. I'm not entirely sure that a new entrepreneur, especially one without the right background, aligns with our values. James felt the familiar ache of disappointment, mingled with frustration, but he kept his face impassive. This wasn't about him alone. It was about challenging the barriers that existed not just for him but for others like him. People like Grant held power not just over financial decisions but over the very narratives that shaped who deserved opportunity and who didn't. The temptation to respond with anger was strong, but James had learned that keeping his dignity intact was his most powerful tool. He nodded thoughtfully, his calm response masking the emotions that churned within him. I understand your point, Mr. Grant. I also believe that every business has to start somewhere, and connections can be built over time. My focus has always been on building a reputable, sustainable company, one that contributes to the community and brings value to those we serve. Grant seemed unfazed, his expression neutral as he looked at James. Value, Mr. Cole, is subjective. What you consider valuable might not align with what our clients expect from an association with Hamilton and Company. James held his gaze, refusing to waver. He wouldn't give Grant the satisfaction of seeing him falter. I appreciate your candor, Mr. Grant. I would hope that Hamilton and Company values merit and potential as much as pedigree. I believe we could achieve a productive partnership. Grant leaned back, regarding James with a mixture of irritation and bemusement. I have my reservations, Mr. Cole. I don't doubt your ambition, but this institution doesn't make exceptions. It's not our responsibility to take on every business looking to make a name for itself. We reserve our resources for clients we deem worthy, and that worth is often established over time and within our community. James felt a flicker of something close to anger, but he pushed it down, reminding himself why he was here. He'd known that stepping into this room meant facing judgment, and he was prepared for it. This wasn't about proving anything to Robert Grant, but rather proving to himself that he could weather whatever tests came his way. "Thank you for your perspective, Mr. Grant," James replied, his tone steady. "I value your time and consideration, and I believe my company aligns with the values of Hamilton and Company, even if those values don't align immediately with my background." Grant raised an eyebrow, his smirk returning as he watched James's composed response. "Well, Mr. Cole, I'll take some time to review your proposal, but I must say, I wouldn't hold out hope for an institution like ours to make unconventional choices." James nodded, holding back the frustration that lingered beneath his calm facade. He rose from his seat, extending his hand once again, knowing it might go ignored. "I appreciate your time, Mr. Grant. I'll look forward to your response." Grant regarded his outstretched hand with mild disdain but accepted it briefly, his grip firm and his eyes cold. "Best of luck, Mr. Cole," he said, the finality in his tone unmistakable. As James walked out of the office, he felt the weight of the encounter settling on him, but he refused to let it define his resolve. He knew the journey would be uphill, but he also knew he wouldn't let prejudice or doubt silence the belief he had in himself and his business. He had faced adversity before, and he would face it again, knowing that his worth wasn't defined by the limited view of those who judged him. As James left the bank that day, his face was calm, but inside, the encounter with Robert Grant had left a bitter taste. However, he wasn't walking away defeated. Instead, he felt a steely resolve solidify within him. He'd been underestimated before, and he knew how to use it to his advantage. There were elements of his background and connections that Grant hadn't considered, pieces of the puzzle that James kept close, revealing only when necessary. A few days later, James returned to his office, a modest but vibrant space in the heart of the city's business district. His staff, a team of dedicated professionals, looked up as he entered. They respected him not only as a boss but as a visionary leader. Despite the challenges he faced, he had built a company with heart, one that served not just clients but communities. Behind him was a wall filled with framed photos and certificates, documenting the steady growth of his business and the people whose lives he'd impacted. In the weeks that followed, James continued his routine, building his company and maintaining relationships with influential figures in his industry. Among his closest connections were two prominent investors and a retired CEO, individuals who had seen James's potential and admired his tenacity. These allies knew his journey and respected him for the man he was, not just for what he had built. While James didn't flaunt his connections, their influence quietly underpinned his reputation, providing him with a strong network few people realized he had. One evening, James attended a local networking event where a few major business figures were present. Among them was Laura Manning, a well-known venture capitalist and board member at Hamilton and Company. As they exchanged pleasantries, Laura expressed her admiration for James's work and hinted at upcoming opportunities. "James, we need people like you, bold, resilient leaders who understand how to bridge gaps. I'm sure we'll find ways to collaborate soon," she said with a knowing smile. James nodded, appreciating her words, though he chose to keep his experience with Grant to himself. He had no need to share it now. He understood that things would reveal themselves in time. The quiet strength he carried, anchored by his connections, reputation, and expertise, remained concealed, waiting for the right moment to come to light. A week later, James received an unexpected call from Robert Grant's assistant, requesting he come back to the bank for a follow-up meeting. The assistant was polite, though her tone suggested that this wasn't an invitation so much as a summons. James felt a flicker of annoyance but agreed, curious to see how Grant intended to handle things. When he arrived, Grant was once again seated behind his desk, his expression as impassive as before. Grant gave James a once-over and then returned his gaze to the documents in front of him, not bothering with small talk. "Mr. Cole," he began curtly, "I've reviewed your application again. While your projections are promising, there are certain elements that remain a concern. Your client list, for instance, lacks the prestige we typically look for. We prefer to work with companies that have more established clientele." James maintained his calm, though he felt his patience wearing thin. He knew Grant was looking for reasons to discredit him, dismissing the loyal customer base he'd spent years cultivating as lacking prestige. However, he reminded himself to hold his ground, to let Grant underestimate him if that's what he needed to feel in control. "I understand, Mr. Grant," James replied, his tone even. "But our client base, while diverse, is solid and growing. We have partnerships with some of the city's leading nonprofits and educational institutions. They might not be household names, but they are reputable and integral to the community." Grant gave a small, dismissive wave. "Community partnerships are admirable, Mr. Cole, but in the world of finance, they mean very little. My concern is about your ability to secure high-value, high-profile clients. That's where real growth lies, and I'm not sure your business model supports it." James remained silent, knowing that arguing would only feed Grant's assumptions. He'd learned long ago that sometimes silence could be the most powerful response, allowing his actions to speak louder than words. As he left the office that day, he could feel Grant watching him go, no doubt convinced that he'd managed to put him in his place. But James had no intention of being reduced by anyone's limited view of his worth. The next encounter came a few days later when Grant called James unexpectedly, summoning him back to the bank once again. This time, the reason for the meeting was murky, with Grant's assistant giving only a vague explanation about needing additional clarification on certain aspects of James's proposal. James sensed that this was another opportunity for Grant to test him, to see if he would tire of the back and forth and give up. But if that was Grant's plan, he was mistaken. Upon arriving, James noted Grant's subtle change in demeanor. His words were sharper, his questions more pointed, challenging every detail of James's business model as though he were looking for holes. "Mr. Cole," Grant said, flipping through James's documents, "I've noticed that while you claim to have year-over-year growth, there are certain quarters where performance dips. Care to explain?" James's eyes remained steady. "Yes, Mr. Grant. Like most businesses, we've had fluctuating quarters, especially in our early stages. However, if you look at the overall trend, you'll see consistent growth, which is why our projections remain strong. We've weathered difficult periods and come out stronger on the other side." Grant raised an eyebrow, clearly dissatisfied. "Perhaps, but resilience isn't enough. Financial stability is key, and I'm still not convinced that you're ready for the level of support Hamilton and Company offers. We prefer clients with a more stable track record." James clenched his jaw but kept his response measured. "I believe that resilience is a key factor in growth, Mr. Grant. It's not only about surviving challenges but thriving afterward. I've built my company with longevity in mind, and I'm here today because I'm confident in its future." Grant made no reply, only a dismissive as he jotted down notes. Once again, James left the bank with Grant's skeptical words lingering in his mind. But rather than discouraging him, they fueled his determination to prove that he didn't need validation from someone so blinded by their own biases. As James continued to push forward with his business, he received unexpected news from his friend Laura Manning, the venture capitalist and board member he had met at the networking event. "James, there's an opening on the Hamilton and Company Board of Advisors," she mentioned casually over lunch one day. "I'm recommending you for the role. You have the tenacity, vision, and experience they need." James was taken aback, but he concealed his surprise. This would be an incredible opportunity and one that would elevate his status in the very institution where Grant had dismissed him. He simply nodded, thanking her for her confidence in him. I appreciate the support, Laura, he said, his voice calm though he felt a surge of satisfaction at the prospect of gaining an influential position within the bank. A few weeks passed, and then, seemingly out of nowhere, he was contacted by another representative from Hamilton and Company. They informed him that his profile was being considered for an advisory role. While James kept the information to himself, he couldn't ignore the irony. He thought back to each encounter with Grant, every presumptive remark and dismissive glance. Soon, he might be on the other side of that desk, someone with influence and authority at the very institution Grant had lorded over him. One morning, James received another call from Grant's assistant. Mr. Cole, Mr. Grant would like to see you this afternoon. He has some final points to discuss. James accepted, preparing for another round of interrogation. When he arrived, Grant greeted him with the same cold demeanor, though his tone seemed even more curt than usual. Mr. Cole, he said, steepling his fingers, I wanted to inform you that after careful consideration, we have decided to decline your application. Hamilton and Company is not interested in pursuing a financial partnership with your company. James felt the words hit, but he held back any reaction. Instead, he gave a small nod, choosing his words carefully. Thank you for your time, Mr. Grant. I appreciate the consideration, he replied, refusing to let Grant see any hint of disappointment. Grant's smirk returned, his voice laced with condescension. You know, Mr. Cole, in this business, it takes more than ambition. It takes connections and the right background to truly succeed. Perhaps, in time, you'll understand that. James remained composed, offering a polite nod before turning to leave. But as he reached the door, he looked back, an air of quiet confidence in his stance. You're right, Mr. Grant, he said evenly. Connections are important. You never know who might be part of yours. The subtle edge in his tone left Grant watching him, an unreadable expression crossing his face. James walked out, leaving the tension hanging in the room, a hint of anticipation brewing as if signaling that something was about to change. A few weeks after the final meeting with Robert Grant, James sat in a different kind of boardroom, surrounded by individuals who appreciated his vision and respected his achievements. The event was a quarterly review meeting for the Small Business Empowerment Alliance, a nonprofit organization he had supported and helped grow since its inception. The alliance worked closely with entrepreneurs from underrepresented communities, providing them with resources, mentorship, and access to funding. James wasn't just a participant. He was a key advisor, someone who had not only invested financially, but had also shaped the organization's direction with his insight and experience. The room was filled with accomplished professionals, each eager to contribute ideas, but all eyes turned to James when he began to speak. He presented a plan for expanding the organization's reach, outlining strategies for increasing partnerships with larger corporations and banks. His ideas were met with nods of approval, and his reputation as a driven, strategic thinker shone brightly in this setting. He spoke confidently, illustrating his points with data and insights, showing a mastery of his field that reflected the years he'd spent honing his skills. We have to build partnerships that not only fund but empower these small businesses, James explained, his voice carrying conviction. Our communities need more than just financial support. They need advocates who understand their challenges and who will stand by them. I'm proposing we create a grant fund specifically for minority-owned businesses and work with institutions that are truly committed to inclusive growth. The room erupted in agreement, and the CEO of the organization smiled with appreciation. James, once again, you're showing us why your leadership is invaluable to this alliance, she said warmly. This plan is exactly what we need to move forward. As the meeting concluded, one of the board members approached James, impressed. James, I've been following your company's growth, he said, extending a hand. It's clear you know how to navigate challenges and make a difference. If you ever need support, don't hesitate to reach out. James shook his hand, offering a small, appreciative nod. He knew his work was making an impact beyond his business. creating meaningful connections with people who recognized his talent and contributions. This moment reminded him of his purpose, reaffirming his belief in what he was building. Despite this success, Grant's rejection lingered in the back of James's mind, a bitter reminder of the challenges he still faced. But he refused to let it diminish his drive. He went about his days with unwavering focus, investing even more energy into his company and the initiatives that were close to his heart. He continued to support his community, helping aspiring entrepreneurs navigate the complex world of business, offering mentorship, and even providing small grants to those he believed in. One morning, as he was preparing for a community event, his phone rang. The caller ID showed it was Laura Manning, the influential venture capitalist who had hinted at opportunities before. "James, I wanted to give you a heads up," she said, her tone enthusiastic. "You're going to be receiving an invitation to join the board of Hamilton and Company. We had a few candidates lined up, but your name was recommended by several members. They've been impressed with your work, especially in community development." James felt a mix of satisfaction and disbelief. Hamilton and Company, the very bank where he had faced rejection, was now extending an invitation for him to join its board. He knew that this role would not only provide him with influence but would also allow him to bring a new perspective to the institution. It was a rare opportunity for change, a chance to reshape the organization from the inside out. Laura continued, "I know Robert Grant handled your loan application, and I'm aware of some of his traditional views. But the board sees something different in you. They're looking for leaders who can help evolve the bank's values, and you fit that vision perfectly." James took a deep breath, letting her words sink in. "Thank you, Laura. I appreciate the support," he replied, his voice steady despite the emotions stirring within him. He could feel the pieces falling into place. This was his moment, a chance to influence an institution that had once overlooked him, to step into a role where he could bring positive change and challenge the very prejudices he'd encountered. The irony wasn't lost on him, and he felt a renewed sense of purpose. As the days passed, anticipation grew within James's team and community. Word began to spread that he was being considered for a prestigious position on the Hamilton and Company board. People admired his resilience and integrity, knowing that he had faced his share of obstacles and still managed to rise above them. His team noticed the renewed energy he brought to the office, and his close friends sensed that something big was on the horizon. At work, James was busier than ever, finalizing plans for his company's expansion, setting up new partnerships, and carefully preparing for the transition if he accepted the board position. His focus was sharper, his drive more intense, and his determination palpable. Even his clients and partners noticed the change, admiring his unwavering resolve to keep pushing forward despite the setbacks he had faced. Laura reached out again a few days later, this time with the official offer for the board position. "James, the board voted unanimously in your favor," she informed him. "We're thrilled to have someone with your expertise and values joining us. You bring a unique perspective that the bank sorely needs." He knew that accepting this position would not only bring him face-to-face with Robert Grant again, but would place him in a position of authority over him. The thought was both gratifying and daunting. It wasn't about revenge. It was about proving that he belonged in these spaces, that he had earned the respect he had always sought. And this time, he would be walking into that bank with more than just a business proposal. He would be walking in with influence. The day finally arrived when James would formally meet the other board members. Dressed impeccably, he walked into Hamilton and Company with an air of quiet confidence, his presence commanding respect. As he entered the boardroom, he noted the familiar faces of the senior executives seated around the large, polished table. They greeted him with warm smiles and handshakes, acknowledging his achievements and his role as an advisor. And then, across the room, he saw Robert Grant. Grant's expression was one of surprise, followed by something that looked like thinly veiled discomfort. His gaze flickered, recognition dawning as he processed James's presence at the table. James met his gaze evenly, offering a polite nod but saying nothing. He took his seat with the other board members, maintaining his calm and composed demeanor. One of the board members began the meeting by officially introducing James. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to announce that Mr. James Cole will be joining us as our newest board advisor. His expertise, especially in supporting underrepresented communities and fostering sustainable business growth, aligns perfectly with our goals for Hamilton and Company's future." James could feel Grant's stare, the disbelief and discomfort radiating from him, but he remained focused, letting the weight of the moment settle in. He wasn't here for approval or validation. He was here to make a difference, to bring his voice to a table that had, until now, dismissed him. When the meeting ended, some of the board members lingered to chat with James, eager to discuss his ideas. As they left the room, he found himself alone with Grant, who seemed torn between resentment and shock. There was a pause, and then Grant spoke, his tone laced with forced professionalism. "Well, Mr. Cole," he said, his voice tight, "I didn't expect to see you here. In this capacity." James smiled politely, his expression calm. "I appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Grant. I believe we'll be able to accomplish a lot together." He let the words hang, knowing that Grant would understand the subtle shift in their dynamic. Grant forced a smile, though it was clear he was struggling to maintain his composure. "Yes, I'm sure we will," he replied, his tone barely hiding his discomfort. As James walked out of the boardroom, he felt the anticipation of what lay ahead. The path had been difficult, but now he was in a position not just to challenge the prejudices he had faced, but to help change the culture that allowed them to exist. He could sense that this was only the beginning of a new chapter, one where his strength and influence would carry far beyond a loan application. A few weeks after officially joining the board of Hamilton and Company, James found himself preparing for a pivotal meeting that would determine the bank's direction in expanding services to underrepresented communities. He had spent hours crafting a presentation that would detail his strategic recommendations, not just as a formality, but as a personal mission. This was his chance to create real change, to bring something meaningful to a place that had once dismissed him based on assumptions. The boardroom was filled with Hamilton and Company's top executives, including the CEO, various board members, and, of course, Robert Grant. As James took his seat, he noted Grant's barely disguised resentment, his jaw tight and his gaze averted. Grant had likely assumed that James would be a silent addition to the board, someone who would fade into the background without impacting his own authority. But today, that assumption would be put to the test. The CEO introduced James to the room once again, emphasizing the expertise he brought, particularly regarding underserved markets and innovative funding solutions. James then stood, his presence calm yet commanding as he began his presentation. His first slides laid out his experience, projects he had led, and the impact of his work on communities often ignored by traditional financial institutions. As he moved through the slides, the executives leaned forward, intrigued by his ideas. Meanwhile, Grant's discomfort was evident as he fidgeted in his chair, watching the room's attention shift firmly to James. "As we know, Hamilton and Company has an established reputation, but we can achieve so much more by expanding our outreach," James said, pausing to let his words settle. "By focusing not only on financial growth but on empowering communities, we position ourselves as leaders in sustainable banking. My own business model has shown that profitability and social impact can go hand in hand. And with the right approach, Hamilton and Company can lead the industry." The room murmured in agreement, but James wasn't done. He pressed a button to reveal his final slide, a partnership proposal that included several influential organizations he had personally collaborated with, including the Small Business Empowerment Alliance and a leading venture capital firm. "Through my connections," James continued, "we have access to partnerships that will provide credibility and open doors for Hamilton and Company to enter these markets responsibly. With board support, I can initiate these discussions immediately. Our mutual goal is to transform this institution into one that not only serves the elite but also builds up communities, demonstrating that we can be both profitable and socially responsible. As James finished, a ripple of nods and quiet applause moved through the room. The executives exchanged impressed glances, recognizing the impact of his vision. Meanwhile, Grant looked visibly stunned, his face pale as the realization dawned that James wasn't just another board member. He was a leader with powerful connections and an expansive vision, one that even the CEO admired. The CEO spoke first, his voice filled with admiration. "James, this is exactly what we need. Your approach is innovative, and I believe it aligns perfectly with our long-term goals. You've brought something invaluable to the table." Grant shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught off guard by the CEO's approval of James's ideas. His initial dismissal of James now hung over him like a dark cloud, and his expression tightened as he struggled to maintain his composure. "Well," Grant said, his voice forced and strained, "Mr. Cole certainly has ambition, but expanding into these markets could be a risk. Our existing clients value exclusivity and stability, and shifting focus might jeopardize that." James met his gaze with calm, unwavering confidence. "Mr. Grant, with all due respect, I believe our clients value growth, integrity, and innovation. By creating new opportunities, we're not just expanding Hamilton and Company's influence. We're elevating its brand to one of respect and progressive leadership." Grant's face reddened, and for a moment, he looked as though he wanted to respond. But he held his tongue, unwilling to further challenge James in front of the CEO and board members. James watched as the weight of his authority shifted, no longer the overlooked applicant seeking a loan but now a board advisor, a person of influence whose voice carried significant weight within the institution. The CEO turned to Grant, his tone firm. "Robert, I understand your concerns, but James's approach could redefine Hamilton and Company for the better. We need to evolve with the times, and James has proven that there's potential here, both financially and socially. I think we should move forward with his proposal." Grant visibly bristled. His hands clenched as he realized he had been outmaneuvered. Every objection he had raised was now invalid, his power diminished by James's calm but undeniable authority. He nodded stiffly, unable to mask his frustration. "Of course, if that's the direction the board wishes to take." The CEO gave a satisfied nod and glanced back at James with a smile. "Thank you, James. Your insights have given us a fresh perspective. I look forward to seeing your initiatives in action." As the meeting concluded, the board members and executives began to file out, many stopping to shake James's hand and offer words of encouragement. The admiration in their eyes was genuine, and James could see that he had earned not just their respect but their trust. He exchanged a few words with Laura, who offered him a knowing smile, clearly proud of his achievements. But it was the final encounter that brought the power shift into sharp relief. Grant approached James as the last of the executives left the room, his expression a mixture of anger and forced civility. He extended a hand, his jaw tight as he spoke. "Mr. Cole, I underestimated you. Clearly, you've accomplished a great deal, and it seems you have the board's support." James shook his hand, his grip firm but calm. "Thank you, Mr. Grant. I've always believed that actions speak louder than words. I look forward to working with you to bring about meaningful change here." The simple, polite statement held a weight that wasn't lost on Grant. The very man he had once dismissed now had the power to influence the very institution he held dear. And it was clear that James wasn't going to let anyone's prejudice dictate his success. Grant's expression darkened as he nodded curtly, offering no further response. As Grant walked away, his shoulders slumped with the knowledge that he had made a grave error in underestimating James. It was clear that the power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. James, once the underdog, now stood as a figure of authority and respect within Hamilton and Company. He had proven that integrity and resilience were more powerful than bias and prejudice, and he was prepared to lead by example. In the days that followed, James's initiatives began to take shape within the bank. With the board's backing, he implemented policies that expanded lending options to underserved communities, created partnerships with nonprofits, and initiated programs that provided financial literacy resources to small business owners. The changes he brought were transformative, enhancing Hamilton and Company's reputation and earning it new clients and loyal supporters. Robert Grant's influence in the bank gradually diminished as James's reputation and respect grew among the board members and executives. While Grant continued in his role, he was no longer the voice of authority he once was. His opinions overshadowed by James's progressive leadership. It became clear that Hamilton and Company was moving in a direction aligned with James's vision, one that celebrated diversity, growth, and inclusivity. Grant watched as James's initiatives garnered praise from both inside and outside the bank, his own initial objections forgotten in light of the overwhelming success that followed. The very values he had dismissed now defined Hamilton and Company, and he found himself left on the sidelines of an institution he once ruled. For James, the transformation wasn't just about personal victory. It was a testament to resilience, to the power of quiet strength in the face of adversity. He knew his journey had only begun, but as he looked around at the institution he was helping to reshape, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had entered Hamilton and Company as an outsider, only to become a respected leader and a catalyst for change. And with every decision he made, he was creating a path not only for himself but for others who, like him, had been underestimated, overlooked, and yet had the courage to rise above. The climax had come and gone, but James's legacy had only begun. He was determined to make Hamilton and Company a place where everyone, regardless of background, could walk through its doors and feel they truly belonged. Robert Grant's professional life had been built on a foundation of authority and control. He had always taken pride in his reputation as a senior officer who made stringent decisions for Hamilton and Company, guarding its resources with an iron fist. But the arrival of James Cole as a board advisor and the changes James brought to the bank had shifted the tides irrevocably. Grant had been unyielding in his belief that Hamilton and Company belonged to people like him, traditional, elitist, and selective. Now, that very mindset was not only outdated but seen as a hindrance to the bank's progress. In the months following James's introduction to the board, whispers circulated around the office. Many of Grant's colleagues began to distance themselves, noting the shifts in the bank's culture and realizing that his rigid views no longer aligned with the institution's future. Grant's usual sphere of influence shrank, and his opinions, once taken as the final word on matters of finance, were now quietly ignored in favor of James's fresh and inclusive approach. Even the executives and clients who had once respected Grant's authority recognized that his stance on exclusivity was hindering the bank's growth. Grant's social circle began to dwindle as well. At high-profile gatherings and industry events, he noticed the subtle changes in how people treated him. Colleagues he'd once considered allies now saw him as the relic of a former era. He overheard murmurs about his outdated perspectives and noted how conversations shifted away from him whenever he expressed views that were at odds with the bank's new direction. Invitations to high-level functions, previously guaranteed, grew scarce, and he felt the discomfort of slowly being edged out of relevance. The final blow came when the bank's CEO, noticing the discomfort Grant's presence was causing among the more progressive board members, had a candid conversation with him. "Robert," the CEO said with a tone of regret, "Hamilton and Company is evolving, and I'm afraid your outlook no longer fits the institution we're striving to build. I think it may be best for both you and the bank if you consider an early retirement. We appreciate everything you've done, but it's time for new leadership." The CEO's words hung in the air, echoing in Grant's mind. There would be no promotion, no further advancement. The institution he'd once ruled with such confidence had passed him by, and the values he had clung to so tightly were now the very cause of his downfall. Grant left the CEO's office with a heavy heart, realizing that his refusal to adapt had left him in a place where he no longer belonged. For James, the transformation at Hamilton and Company marked more than just a personal victory. It was a turning point in his career and in the institution itself. His initiatives had not only proven financially viable but had also improved the bank's public image, attracting clients from various backgrounds who appreciated the bank's commitment to inclusivity. What had once been a symbol of exclusivity now became a symbol of empowerment for communities and businesses that had previously felt excluded. James's programs flourished, extending financial literacy resources and funding opportunities to small businesses that would have otherwise been overlooked. He established a mentorship program within the bank, pairing experienced financial advisors with minority-owned businesses, offering guidance and support that went beyond simple transactions. His efforts were recognized across the industry, earning Hamilton and Company accolades for being a progressive, community-oriented institution. It wasn't long before the press took notice. Articles were written about Hamilton and Company's shift in culture, with James highlighted as the catalyst for the changes. Headlines described him as a visionary leader, someone who understood both the financial and social impact of banking. The satisfaction he felt was quiet yet profound. He had achieved what he had set out to do, not through resentment or retaliation, but by demonstrating resilience and integrity. One evening, after an awards ceremony where Hamilton and Company had been recognized for its contribution to small business growth, James stood in his office, overlooking the city skyline. He reflected on his journey, from the moments of frustration he'd felt when facing Grant's discrimination to the gradual, determined steps he'd taken to overcome those obstacles. He understood that this victory was more than just about his personal success. It was a statement of what could be achieved by holding on to one's values in the face of prejudice. The team he had built at his company thrived alongside him, and together they had grown in both reach and reputation. It was a triumph not just for him but for all those who believed in the same vision, who had quietly supported him through each step of his journey. As he stood there, looking out over the city, James thought back to that first day at Hamilton and Company, to the uncomfortable glances, the unspoken doubts, and Robert Grant's dismissive attitude. He realized that Grant's actions, though painful, had been instrumental in shaping his own determination. Without those challenges, he might never have been driven to take his influence to the board level, to actively create change in an industry that needed it so desperately. He also thought about the lessons he'd learned along the way. Perseverance, he realized, was not just about withstanding adversity. It was about rising above it with purpose and vision. His journey wasn't just a personal struggle. It was a symbol of the battles faced by countless others who had been told they didn't belong, who had been forced to prove themselves repeatedly. And now, his journey had led him to a place where he could open doors for others, where he could make the path a little smoother for those who would come after him. James understood that the true power of leadership lay in lifting others up. His time at Hamilton and Company had shown him that while titles and positions held value, it was the principles one stood for that truly defined a legacy. And his legacy would be one of resilience, integrity, and a commitment to inclusivity. As he closed his office and prepared to head home, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He knew that his work was far from over. There were still challenges ahead, but he welcomed them, knowing that each step he took would be another opportunity to make a difference. He had faced adversity with dignity, he had conquered it with grace, and now he was leaving a path that others could follow. He thought of the young entrepreneurs he'd met, the ones who reminded him of himself, filled with dreams yet aware of the obstacles ahead. He knew that his work would help them, that the changes he'd brought to Hamilton and Company would ripple outwards, giving them a chance he had fought so hard to claim for himself. And for the first time, he felt that he truly belonged, not just at Hamilton and Company, but in every space he had entered with quiet strength and unwavering belief. His journey had taught him that resilience wasn't just about enduring. It was about transforming adversity into purpose. As he left the building that night, his steps were lighter, his heart filled with gratitude for the path he had carved, not only for himself but for all those who needed to believe that change was possible. The city lights sparkled around him as he walked away from the building, and he felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that he had left his mark. He had created a legacy not built on dominance or power, but on empathy, inclusivity, and respect. And as he continued his journey, he knew that wherever he went, those values would guide him, lighting the way for others to follow. In the end, James understood that his triumph wasn't about defeating Robert Grant or securing his position on the board. It was about proving, both to himself and the world, that resilience and integrity could overcome prejudice and open doors that had once seemed firmly shut. It was about creating a world where success wasn't measured by exclusivity but by the impact one had on others. And as he walked into the night, the satisfaction of knowing he had done just that settled within him like a gentle, enduring flame, a quiet victory that would continue to inspire long after the applause had faded.